This video is about a very important but also very simple property called the zero product property. We'll see what it means and we'll see how to use it to solve equations. So the zero product property is A times B equals 0, meaning any product, any two things that multiply together equals 0 if and only if either A is equal to 0 or B is equal to 0. This is going to be a lot like the absolute value equations. The main idea here is that if A times B equals 0, there are two ways to make that happen. So we need to find both possible ways to make that happen in order to solve the equation. Let's see what we mean here. I have an equation here, x minus 5 times x plus 4 equals 0. Notice how this is the same thing I had before. This is A times B. It doesn't matter that A and B look a little bit longer and more complicated now. This is still a pair of factors multiplied together to make 0. Because of my zero product property, I can say that either A, the first factor, x minus 5, equals 0, or B, the second factor, x plus 4, equals 0. So we're going to use a technique called split and solve, which is not a very mathy term, but it works for me. Split the factors up into two separate equations and solve them both. This is applying the zero product property. Very, very often, once we've done this split, we'll have two very easy equations to solve. For this one, we'll add 5 to both sides. For the other one, we'll subtract 4 from both sides. And if you don't write the minus 4 on both sides, that's okay. That's something you're expected to know how to do anyway. What you have to make sure you show are a couple of things. First, you have to have this equals 0 here, because the whole premise of splitting and solving is only based on the zero product property. It only works if the two factors multiply to 0. Second, it only works if you have a product of two factors set equal to 0. This has to be multiplication in here. If there was a plus sign in there, that would ruin everything. Wouldn't be able to do the zero product property then. And you do have to make sure that you actually show both of the two equations that you split it into before you solve them and write your solution. The way you'll see the answer written often is as a solution set. X is equal negative 4 or 5. Those are all the numbers that x could be. If you leave it like this, that's totally fine. I just don't want you to be confused if you see this in a problem somewhere as the multiple choice or something like that. That's just how we write the answers. You might be thinking to yourself, this all seems a little bit too simple. Also, we don't usually see this in a problem. And you're right. But what we can do for lots of other problems is get to that point. So if I have the equation x squared minus 5x plus 8 equals 2, neither piece of the zero product property is what I want it to be. I don't have the equals 0, and I don't have just a product of two factors here. Neither one of those two things are there, but both of them can be found pretty easily. So what we're going to do to make that happen is I'll start by emptying out one side. That equals 0 is the first thing I need to set up. Without the equals 0, nothing else works. So I will empty out one side to get to equal 0. Next step, let's switch colors for it. The next thing we're going to do is factor. Because I got the equals 0, what I don't have is the product of two factors, right? I said if it's plus or minus in between everything, it doesn't work. I need those to be a product. Well, I can turn a polynomial into a product just by factoring it. I deliberately picked one that most of you can probably do just by looking at it. If you think for a minute, look for numbers that multiply to 6 and add to 5. Well, the only numbers that work, add to negative 5. They both have to be negative. So x minus 3 times x minus 2 equals 0. And I can't stress how important this equals 0 is. You have to keep writing it every step of the problem. Every step. If you drop it off for one step and then put it back in later on, you'll get marked off for not having written it down the whole time. It is a big, big deal. But now that we have the setup that we want, we've got the product of two factors that multiply to 0. That's exactly what the zero product property is for. So now we can split and solve. Notice how we had to get that set up just the way we wanted it first. But once we have it, we can separate it into 2. That's the split. And then we can solve both of them. X equals, if I add 3 to both sides, x equals 3. If I add 2 to both sides, x equals 2. And so my solution is x equals 2 or 3. I will point out to you that with polynomials, including quadratics, so all of the equations you'll see this unit that just have quadratics in it, cannot have extraneous solutions. So while you're certainly encouraged to check to make sure you're right, you don't have to, because as long as you did the math correctly, as long as you didn't make a mistake, your answers will work. So that's why I'm not going to check for extraneous solutions here. Okay, we'll try a couple of these. I'm not going to do all of these, but we'll try a couple. Let's do the first one here because it's a little bit different. 5x squared equals 80x. The first thing you might notice is there's no equals 0. Well, so we're going to get it. We're going to set that up to be equal 0. That should be your first thought every time, is to get everything out of one side. So I'm going to move everything over. Subtract 80x from both sides, and I have my equal 0. Notice how when I subtract 80x here, I can't really put minus 80x under 5x squared because they're not like terms. So when I subtract 80x, I'm going to do it just a little bit off to the side. So that way, when I write down my next step, I'll know not to do 5 minus 80. I can't combine those terms because they're not like terms. Another trick, which is helpful, you don't have to do it separately in this case, but I'll show you how to because it does often make your life easier. If you have a number that you can divide by on both sides, do it. It makes your life easier. I can divide both sides by 5. So that it's just x squared minus 16x equals 0, because 0 divided by 5 is still 0. And so now I'm factoring. Remember, it's always easier to factor when there's no lead coefficient. So that's helpful for us. This factoring is a little bit different. Remember, we had a couple of different ways to factor. The first one we learned, the easier one, is helpful here, because there's a GCF to pull out. I can undistribute the x. And that would be x times x minus 16 equals 0. If I undistribute that x, I still have what I'm looking for, which is I've got my two factors, the product of two factors that multiply to 0. I've got the two things that I need in order to split and solve. So that's what I'll do. I will split and solve. The factor on the left, I know you look at it and you're like, wait, that's weird. I don't know what to do there. But it's easier because the whole factor is just x. So that factor could equal 0. And I've already solved it. There's nothing to do there. X equals 0 is one of my two solutions. For the other one, we'll add 16 to both sides. And so my two solutions are x equals 0. Let me write this here. Or x equals 16. And that would be your solution. I will do one more here. Move these out of the way. So I will do this one, number 7. Need a little bit more space because the factoring takes longer. Go through the steps again. Hopefully you can pause the video now and just see if you can work this out on your own, and then just watch to check and see what happens. Make sure that we're doing the same thing. I will empty out both sides. Again, putting the negative 5 a little bit off to the side because it's not a like term. so that I have something equal to 0. Step 1, done. Step 2 is to factor. Remember, when you have that lead coefficient there, it does get a little bit more complicated to factor. This is what we learned how to do at the end of last unit. We are going to need to chop that 9x into 2 terms so that we can factor by grouping. I'm going to look for 2 numbers that multiply to negative 10 and add to positive 9, which would be positive 10x and negative 1x. You don't have to write that negative 1 if you don't want to. So just a quick reminder that what I've done is I've split this 9x into 2 terms, so that now I have 4 terms and I can factor by grouping. I'll pull out the 2x from the first grouping. And because I want the lead term in every group, in every binomial, to be positive, I'm going to pull out this negative also. It doesn't look like there's a GCF in negative 1x minus 5, but I can pull out a negative so that I change the sign. That way I have x plus 5 in both. And I can pull out the x plus 5. And I'm done factoring. Notice how there's no more adding or subtracting in between the two. Last step there was, which is why I couldn't just split and solve yet. And this is why when we learned how to factor, I made such a big deal out of knowing when you were going to write a plus sign or a minus sign in there and when to leave it as multiplication. But we factored, so our next step is to split and solve. X plus 5 equals 0. That one's the easy one. The other one, it's not hard, but it's one step longer. 2x minus 1 equals 0. Well, remember, we're solving for x, so I'll add 1 and then divide by 2. X equals 1/2. So my solutions are negative 5 and 1/2. And now you know how to solve a quadratic equation by factoring.